So I've made no bones about the fact that Mark is my favorite gospel. That's why when Bible study, when we were talking about like what should we do, I'm like Mark, because it's my favorite, right? And I talked a little bit last week about how Mark is the people's gospel, that it's actually a narrative tradition, an oral tradition that sort of got transcribed down. And so sort of in the scholarly works, then people are like, wow, the grammar of this Greek is really bad, but they're missing the point because it's an oral tradition. People are telling these stories. And what Mark does is actually, it's really interesting because in the ways that stories do, they braid together to inform one another. So we have two separate stories here going on. We have the story of Jairus' daughter, and we have the story of the woman who was bleeding, and then we kind of pick back up with Jairus' daughter. So the structure of it is supposed to tell us something in that these stories are existing side by side for a reason. So you pay attention to like, where do we go from like this story here to, and what comes after it. It's a narrative arc, right? So when something is sort of shoved into the middle of a story, that tells you to sit up and pay attention and also put them in conversation with one another. So we kind of want to separate out, sometimes we would just like, oh, let's just talk about Jairus' daughter and skip all that bit in the middle and talk about that separately. But Mark really did that on purpose, was to kind of bookend or sandwich this story of this woman with Jairus' daughter on either side. And you can tell that it was intentional because, again, there is this sort of like throwaway line. Mark sort of buries the lead a little bit. And it says right there at the end that the little girl is about 12 years old, which is a direct through line for how long the woman has been ill. It says she's been bleeding for 12 years, right? So that's a large context clue that these things are supposed to go together, that they're sort of two sides of a coin, or they're in conversation with one another, that wasn't, that's a little on the nose when you know what to look for, right? And so the theme of both of these stories that I see, at least today, is the theme of touch. So in both of these stories, we have the verb for touch showing up like 6 or 7 times throughout the set of verses that we had. So Jairus comes to Jesus, and he says, my little girl is ill. And he falls down on his feet. And in that, there is a healthy distance, like bro distance, like a masculine distance, right? So you have two teachers who are, who have mutual respect. You got leaders, but you still have this man who is losing some of his dignity to fall on his knees at the feet of someone who actually would have been his peer or close to it, right? To say, I am desperate because my child is ill. And so Jesus is like, yeah, I'm here for it. Like, I'm going to go, be with you in this. Like, this is something that we can do together, that there is healing that is possible for this child. And then you have, sort of a situation where I call it teeming humanity. So if you've ever been in a really like crowded place, a parade or a march, or sometimes even the grocery store, especially before a big snowstorm, you're bumping shoulders with everybody. And that's kind of what this is, right? So this woman who doesn't have a name, and yet her story is so important, she says, this is the guy who can help me. And I love how Mark puts it, that she's blown all of her money on physicians, and not only did they not help, they made it worse. And I think any chronically ill person can really relate to that, right? You dump all your money and you're like, what is gonna work for me? And they say, try this drug or try this procedure, and it just keeps not working and it bankrupts you. Like, that is a story that we understand quite well in America, right? And so when I read this woman, I'm like, ooh, I get you. in this way. And so she's sort of using this teeming humanity for her benefit, because she's like, this guy, there's something about him, and I've tried literally everything else. And maybe if I can just reach out and touch him, this will work when nothing else has. But she's taken her life in her hands. Because she was bleeding, and so what the Greek refers to as specifically menstrual bleeding. But according to Levitical law, if someone is menstrually bleeding, they are unclean for the time of their bleed. And so this woman, if she's perpetually bleeding for 12 years, those of us who menstruate, like that's sounds miserable to me, right? And she's been considered unclean for that entire time. So that means she is on the periphery of society, literally can't touch anyone else because her uncleanness will transmit to them. And so everyone's like, I don't want to go through the ritual bath. I'm not going to mess with you. Like, I just don't want to touch you. So with that kind of social parameter, this woman probably has not been touched with care for over a decade. And not only is she untouchable, but everything that she touches gets sullied. So the Levitical law says that every couch she sits on, every bed, every pot she touches is also ritually unclean. So she has to live in her own little bubble of things that she can touch that is outside the reach of the rest of the community. So you have to understand her desperation, what she's actually doing, what the traditions that she is bucking to say, you know what? I'm going to take matters literally into my own hands, and I'm going to touch this person. Because Jesus, if he had responded according to how he was acculturated, could have punished her for making him unclean. Not only do women not approach men, but an unclean woman definitely doesn't approach a teacher, a healer. And so I imagine how at the end of her rope she must have been. How she had tried literally everything else. How desperate to be healed she was. That she would risk literally life and limb to be brought back into the folds of community by risking what Jesus' reaction may have been. But this is also coming on the heels of the story we talked about last week, the person who was plagued by an unclean spirit out by the tombs. So Jesus sought out that person out at the tombs. So we know that Jesus doesn't mind these places that are ritually unclean, that he will go and he will touch, and he will be with, and he will call by their name the people who are unclean. But this woman doesn't necessarily have the same context that we do. We call that dramatic irony, right? Like that's what Mark is working with. So we know Jesus' heart in this way. That he would go out to the tombs, that he would touch the unclean people. But this woman is just like, I've heard about this healer, and maybe it will work for me. And she's risking something by reaching out to him. She's risking a lot by reaching out to him. And then there's this interesting thing that happens where the people are pressing in on Jesus, and she grabs the corner of his cloak and she feels that she's been healed. And Jesus feels that he's done a healing he wasn't a part of. He's like, hey, wait a second. I felt the power go out of me, right? Like something's happening here that I didn't initiate, right? And He's like, who touched me? And all the disciples are like, you see that we're like in a crowd, right? Like there's no telling who touched you. He's like, no. Somebody touched me with intent. And they're like, how are we going to find out who that is? There's like, tens of people around here. Like everyone's bumping shoulders. How's this going to work? And he goes, no, there's something important that happened here and I don't want to miss it. Because he could have easily just let it slide, right? Someone hip checks you in the line, and you're like, okay, fine, whatever, right? Like there's this way that, like, especially when you're in that kind of close quarters, that you just kind of let things slide. People bump on you, people step on your feet. Like it just happens when you're like in that kind of space. But he goes, no, something important happened here, and he stops everything. And then I just imagine what that woman was feeling, because here she is, she feels in her body that she's been healed for the first time in over a decade. And then he pulls the emergency brake. He's like, no, I'm not moving until we handle this. And she's like, because she is taking such a risk, right? And so the verses say she comes to him with like fear and trembling. And I can imagine what that's like. Here's this transgression that I've made. And I don't know how this guy is going to respond. And I just imagine her anxiety and everything. I risked it all. I have been risking it all for years. And here is this last shred of possibility that I have. And maybe I lost that too, because now I'm not only ritually unclean, but I'm not a good ritual person now, because I didn't abide by the rules that were keeping me bound. So she comes to him, shaking in her boots. She says, it was me. And he goes, daughter, this beautiful name of intimacy and care. He says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go and be healed of your disease. Her faith. Let's just sit with that for a second. It isn't him himself that made her well. He felt the power go out of him, but it was her faith, her willingness to be just as needful and just as desperate as she was, that let her come out from behind all of these rules and regulations, the things that kept her separate, the way that she'd been living for 12 years. It was her stepping out in faith, taking that risk. And that is what healed her. And then she's let go to go figure out what life looks like. And I can only imagine, because life expectancies weren't super long. So she maybe was like going to live to 40 or 45. And so you think about almost a third of her life has been spent apart from everyone. And I wonder, what does she go do now? What is she liberated to go be now? Because she had money, right? We know that from the text. There was something there. She had a livelihood. She had maybe a family. She had something going for her, and she lost it all because of her illness. And I imagine what that weight lifted off would have felt like. But also kind of the terror, because at least you know what the boundaries are, and now suddenly you're unbound. And that's scary. What do we do with that? And then Jesus carries on his way because that kind of transformative work is just a Tuesday for him. And he gets to the door, and people say, "You're too late." And I can imagine how Jairus was feeling, right? Because he's like, "I'm hurting this teacher down the road trying to get to my daughter. Like, I need you. This is an emergency." But this guy had some more social clout, right? He had a home, and he had a family, and he had a status that he was drawing on to say, "Jesus, pay attention to me. I am worthy of your care." And then this woman got in the way, and she halted this progress. We were almost there. We could have made it. It's too late. And I imagine how a father's heart would break, and how maybe he would resent that woman who got healed, because if Jesus had just kept going, if he had just got to move on, maybe it wouldn't have been too late. And isn't that how it works, right? Healing is zero sum. I have to get mine, because if you get yours, then I'm not quite as free as I could have been. And Jesus says the same word, pistis in Greek, the same word. He says, it's okay. Have faith. And at the same time, we got the people on the periphery being like, "What are you talking about? She's dead. There is nothing else here." And doesn't the finality of that moment mirror what was happening with the woman in the story in the middle? There are no more cures for you. There is no more possibility. You don't have any more money. The physicians are all making it worse. There's no hope. And Jesus says she's not dead. She's sleeping. There is something here yet to revive. Over and against the wisdom of the crowd that says, no, 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 death is final. Jesus says, watch. And then what does he do? He reaches out and he touches her hand. And that's another unclean act, because you're not supposed to touch dead bodies. And here's this girl, this man of stature who has a groundswell of popular opinion, and he touches this 12-year-old girl. And he says, "Little girl." Another beautiful form of endearment. "Little girl, get up. Get up." And she does. And then, because it's just Tuesday, he's on his way to his next miracle. But what does he do before he leaves? He says, "Give her something to eat. Make sure that this little girl's body is taken care of, that she is nourished, and that she is well." And then he leaves. And I can imagine what's going on in Jairus, right? Because he's still got this anger left over because he was delayed, and then he's got this grief, but then maybe, like what a storm of emotion in that man. But then finally, just the relief that his daughter, who he stood to lose, is alive and walking and eating, and that she has possibility for life that he couldn't imagine even hours before, that he didn't even know if he was allowed to hope for. And it was his desperation that put him down on his knees in front of Jesus and said, "Heal her." It was his faith. So I'm curious about this link between faith and desperation and liberation. about the possibility of unending life that happens when we want it bad enough. So what pushes us into that place? Yesterday, I was in a workshop with Reverend Dr. Barbara Holmes, who is a Black contemplative, and the theme of the workshop was crisis contemplation. And so when we have trials and struggles, when we are in crisis, and the way that she defines crisis is that when every other hope has been stripped away, when there is no possibility of human help, you fall through the center of what you thought you knew into an untold reality, and there is nothing left. And isn't that what's happening in this story, right? The physicians failed the hemorrhaging woman. She didn't have any more money. All of her safety nets couldn't fix this, and she had nothing, and so she reached for God, and God was there to meet her faith. And same with Jairus, right? All of his power and status, all of his knowledge, all of his learning, all that got stripped away, and everyone was saying, there's nothing more to be done. She's gone. She's dead. And his desperation, his faith, his crisis drove him to his knees to reach out for Jesus and faith, and God was there to hold him. And then it was there that possibility arose. I have a professor from seminary. We've read his books here in Percolate, Miguel de la Torre. And he says we got to embrace hopelessness. And I question that some, right? But his idea is that, hey, if we keep putting hope in the systems that are going to fix it for us, the physicians, the doctors, our power and status, the learning that we think that we have, then we keep perpetuating them. But it's when those things break apart that God is able to act, and that this true subversion of what we think is possible happens. And who does it happen for? Women. Poor women. Little girls. The people with power who humble themselves to be able to reach for it, who get to that point in themselves that says, I don't care what the law is. I don't care what's keeping me away from this. I don't care all of the reasons that people are trying to talk me out of doing this crazy thing that I'm about to go do, but they leapt for it. I kind of imagine almost like the way that Elvis would do a knee, like the knee slide, right? In front of Jesus, saying, please, in this moment. Barbara Holmes yesterday talked about the ways that individual contemplation can be part of a communal contemplation. And she played this incredible song with just 2 words. Oh, Jesus. Sung at the Trinity United Church of Christ on the south side of Chicago, a flagship Black congregation in our denomination. And she said, that becomes the wail too deep for words that the Holy Spirit translates. That there, in our desperation, there, when we are in touch with our greatest need, when we reach out for God, even though everything is telling us not to, that it's dumb for us to think that there was something that could be possible, that it defies any of our best thinking, that if we get in touch with that place, that we understand being held, being nurtured, being nourished in the presence of God. We are on the precipice of the Lenten season. And I believe that these stories are an invitation to get in touch with those parts of ourselves that are so deeply in pain, that are so needful, that are so wanting of connection, that are so hungry for God's presence. There are lots of doors, but desperation is a powerful one. And it is our faith that heals. And God makes sure that we are nourished, not just back up on our feet, but that our whole selves are cared for. And we get a new lease on life if we can break through the things that keep us apart. All of the messages, all of the shoulds, all of the shame, and reach out for the God who is there, the God who is attentive to our individuality, who knows when they have been touched and wants to see us standing there and call us daughter or son or child. And who knows then where the path of that kind of transformed life, that kind of encounter will lead.